most people, Jhum or shifting cultivation conjures up images of pockmarked hills, burned debris, slash and burn. But experts will argue that that's just one side of the image. It's an incomplete image because it ignores the other side of Jhum cultivation, that of rich agro-biodiversity, equitable access to land, dietary diversity, and so on. Now, this system of cultivation has been the system of cultivation of our forefathers and our foremothers, of course, and a large percentage of our farmers are still, even today, shifting cultivators. Our discussion for today is Jhum Cultivation, Sustainability, Livelihoods and the Way Forward. And joining me on this discussion are three eminent panelists. The first, joining me in the studio, is Dr. Vincent Darlong. For a lot of people in rural development, I think Dr. Darlong really needs no introduction, but let me say a few words. He is, of course, a former Vice-Chancellor of the Martin Luther Christian University, Shillong, and he's also a man of immense experience in the field of rural development, having worked with IFAD and a lot of other international organizations. He even has a PhD on shifting cultivation. So, Dr. Darlong, welcome to this discussion.
Thank you.
And joining me by video link, first and foremost from Nepal, is Dr. D.K. Chetri, who is the retired Joint Director of the Agriculture Department, Government of Nagaland. Dr. Chetri, welcome to this discussion. And finally, of course, also on video link is Mr. Amba Jamir. He is a policy analyst and development specialist, and currently he is Vice President of the Integrated Mountain Initiative. And he was instrumental in convening a thing called the International Dialogue on Shifting Cultivation, which culminated in the Shillong Declaration. We will find out more about that. Welcome to the discussion, Mr. Jamir. All right, I think we are ready to move ahead. So, Dr. Darlong, let me start with you since you're here with me in the studio. This conflicting view of Jhum cultivation. So, is it really this backward, rudimentary agricultural practice, or is it this eco-friendly, farming system, cultivating system? Maybe you could enlighten us on that.
Well, thank you, Mark, for initiating this particular topic on shifting cultivation. This has been a topic in the global scenario, including Southeast Asian countries and of course in India as well, particularly the Northeast. Over the past 10,000 years, this is a practice that has survived. Even today, it is still quite vibrant in many communities across the Northeast. And of course, looking at the shifting cultivation, through the lens of the policy and authorities, it's something that needs to be looked at from the biodiversity perspective or having adverse impact on environment and very many other things. But through the lens of the shifting cultivators, when you see this, we have to appreciate that this is a practice that's perhaps feasible only in a landscape like Northeast, where you really don't have flatland where you have to promote valley cultivation. You have large areas, nearly 97 to 98% of the hill areas where possibly only slash and burn cultivation might be the best option. Second thing, through their lens, if we see, this is also a practice that has brought in a wealth of agro-biodiversity over centuries or over many, many years through that process. Third is, shifting cultivation has to be seen not just the slash and burning part of it. It has both agricultural phase and the forestry phase. To the shifting cultivators, actually, this whole gamut of the whole practice is both farming phase and the forestry phase. Unless these two are integrated intimately, for them, that is what is Jhum. Philosophically, Jhum actually promotes forestry, because without forest, you can't have the next Jhum.
Exactly. Mr. Jamir, obviously, Jhum cultivation still has a lot of negative connotations for a lot of people, like I mentioned, pockmarked hills and all that. But do tell us, if you look from that point of view, and if you look at this very outdated view of Jhum and shifting cultivation, what would you say to people who still hold this view?
I think, first of all, Dr. Darlong has very clearly established some very basics of understanding the system. And what a lot of people don't realize is shifting cultivation must be looked at more than just as a, it's not just about a production system. Shifting cultivation is a system that looks at resource management, that looks at resource governance, that looks into people's social and spiritual requirements, that deals with cultural and traditional practices, and so many other things beyond just ecology or beyond just economics. And people tend to forget that. A lot of people tend to look at it either from just an ecological perspective or from just an economic perspective or even from a forestry perspective, but the social dimensions of shifting cultivation is something that really is very important, because at the very end of the day, whatever we have, whatever we are managing, and whatever we are doing to sustain our environment, until and unless the needs of the people are respected and recognized, until and unless their traditional knowledge systems and the institutions that govern these practices are recognized, it will be quite futile to just talk about shifting cultivation from a very myopic view of just economics, agriculture, and production.
Okay, we will get into the details of that later, but let me bring in Dr. Chetri at this point of view, because the government system has been to promote, to sort of like discourage Jhum and shifting cultivation, and to promote a sort of like a more settled agriculture. So, because you're a retired official of the agriculture department, of course, we're not asking you to speak on behalf of all agriculture departments, but is this transition to settled agriculture necessary?
Actually, from the point of view of the policy, because as already explained, people look at Jhum in a very myopic way. It doesn't look at a very broad perspective, because each department, like for example, there are a lot of government department who promotes their own kind of they have their own mandate, and they promotes accordingly. For example, the forest department, they try to promote the forest. They look Jhum as a forest land, whereas agriculture department, they also look Jhum as an agriculture land. So when they give a reporting on what exactly Jhum area is, or Jhum, the statistics of Jhums, there's a mismatch. There's a policy mismatch is there. And so that is why it cannot be truly a project or a policy cannot be designed in a very prospective way on Jhum. So that is the major issues right now.
Okay, Dr. Jamir, you talked about you said the cultural and the spiritual, and also spiritual aspects and connection of people to Jhum and shifting cultivation. Can you elaborate on those a bit?
The very practice itself is where people's social and cultural institutions revolve around. If you look at most of the communities across the world and also in the Northeast that practice shifting cultivation, all or almost every festival that we celebrate, every major festival revolves around shifting cultivation. It has such great significance to the way the communities plan the annual activity calendar based around shifting cultivation activities. And then to top it all, the way that resources are managed by the community, the way that resources are equitably shared amongst people who have land and people who do not have land, and there's are many other things which, as an institution, as a community, the work that is done to ensure that the community has a sustainable food production system, people are accessible to landed resources in an equitable manner, eco-biodiversity is maintained, there is equal opportunity for both men and women to participate in not just field activities but also decision making. In fact, most decision making in shifting cultivation, starting from seed selection to seed storage to so many other activities, are driven by women. And this is where the space for a community to work together and grow together and to be grounded to the knowledge systems, to be grounded to the traditions, and to be grounded to the soil where the ancestors have lived and roamed. I think that is the very essence of why shifting cultivation is more than just a food production system.
Dr. Dalong, that's a very important point there that Dr. Jameel raised about this bond between shifting cultivation and access to land. Of course, this is increasingly under threat, and when this is increasingly under threat, it's also, which means livelihoods of people are under threat. How do you see this being resolved?
I think this observation is very, very true. I mean, if you look at the community institutions and governance system that has evolved over the years across the tribes in the Northeast, even beyond other, this has been, as Jamir has mentioned, is around the practice of shifting cultivation. Look at the dances, folklores, and traditional tales. All of this has also evolved around the cycles of shifting cultivation. Mm-hmm. And then you have large number of vocabularies and also words that are related to the shifting cultivation, not just the crop, mm-hmm. but also festivals and very many other things that is around that. And also the food system, the way how food is prepared, is again because of the crops that is coming from the shifting cultivation, mm-hmm. be it from the agricultural area or from the fallow areas. So when you compromise all of these, many of these social capital or biocultural assets mm-hmm. are actually being compromised with, being lost, and that is what is happening. Many communities who are no longer practicing Jhum are actually trying to revive some of these lost biocultural traditions, Okay. And when you look at this, especially the young generations of today, the way how you value things, I think there are lots to be done. Having said that, indeed, this is one of the assets, not just Jhum or shifting cultivation as you see as a practice, but the social capital, biocultural capital and assets that have grown across the communities, mm-hmm. as Mr. Jamir have mentioned, is actually much more valuable than the practice itself. Mm-hmm. So therefore, this is one thing that needs to be looked from the human perspective, both from food system, environmental system, biocultural systems, mm-hmm. and also governance and institution systems.
Okay. Let's take the issue of agro-biodiversity. Dr. Chetri, I'll ask you this question, because that is one thing that a lot of people, a lot of experts have agreed, including yourselves, of course, that this is a very agro-biodiverse farming system, shifting cultivation, compared to settled agriculture. Can you tell us more about these positive aspects of agro-biodiversity under Jhum or shifting cultivation?
It's very wonderful to see how Jhum is being done. Jhum is mostly practiced in the sloppy land. It starts from a very altitudinal aspects. If you talk about from 350 to it goes is in an entire slope up to more than 1,000 MSL, meters from the sea level. So in that, if you try to grow the crops, there are different varieties of crop, even for that matter, rice. If you talk about rice in the lower zone, there are different varieties. If you do to middle zone, there are different variety of a paddy. Zone, there are different variety. So this Jhum system is that it's a wonderful practices where number of varieties, number of germplasms, for that matter, land races are being conserved, are being grown by the farmers in a particular area. So it's since therefore, like it's not only from the point of view of the one particular crop, it's the entire gamut of crops. Like for example, the whole food systems, the food baskets, it contains from oilseed to pulses to vegetables to condiments, spices. So it's a big, huge cafeteria of crops being cultivated in the Jhum. So this Jhum system not only solves the food security problem, it also has a capacity to conserve these crops, the biodiversity of crops, different variety of crops. You'll be
Mr. Jamil, let me bring you in here because you mentioned a very important aspect there, the gender dimension of how women play a very important and very key role in shifting cultivation and how they are a necessary part of the system of Jhum cultivation. Tell us more about that, and maybe if you could contrast that with the changes that is being brought upon the cultivation system with the introduction of settled agriculture or the transition to settled agriculture.
The role of women in agriculture traditionally has been very, very important. Women are in most societies custodians of knowledge with regards to seed management. They are the ones who decide which seeds are to be managed, which seeds are to be selected, which seeds are to be stored, and which seeds are to be cropped then whenever it needs to be cropped. That is not just the skill and ability of women, but the ability to maintain this tradition and pass it along. This is really, really important. So, as knowledge keepers, as custodians of seeds, I think that is the first thing. This other part is women bear a brunt of a majority of the work in shifting cultivation. Of course, the heavy physical work is done by the men when it comes to fire and when it comes to slashing of the forest or jungle or whatever. But after that, throughout the cropping phase, especially when you have to do the weeding 2 3 times in a cycle, it is usually the women who do this, and that is really, really a back-breaking part of the activity that they do. But at the same time, because they get involved in it in so many ways, because they are so involved in it in not just activity physical activities but also decision making with regards to what types of seeds to save, what type of seeds to store, what types of seeds to crop, women have a big say in resource management within the family. Unlike now, when you have sedentarized forms of agriculture, which are market based cropping that is happening, this is where the whole defeminization of women starts happening. The women start losing control of the resources. They start losing control of the ability to make decisions, because now it is the commercial crops that are got from government suppliers or from the markets, which the men go and bring and buy. They crop it, and then they themselves take care of the business of dealing with traders and other things. Whereas in shifting cultivation, many of the uncultivated wild leaves and mushrooms and other fruits and crops that are got from the fallow forest, it was a woman who would gather this, take it to the markets, sell it, come back with cash, and manage it within the family. So that is the difference when it comes to larger market-driven cash crops. This ability or the responsibility of women has been taken away as men tend to.
That's a very, very important point that you make here, that the role has been taken away, and with the introduction of a modern system of agriculture. So, Dr. Dalong, let me start with you here and ask you, we've all discussed this, all the fine points and all the good points of shifting cultivation when it comes to food security, dietary diversity, gender balance, agro-biodiversity. When all these positives have been brought out, why is it that there is still this push by the powers that be to transition to settled agriculture? Why is it there?
Well, I think this could partly be because the land system is changing very, very fast, And why this is being pushed is primarily because the current Jhum practice with very, very short cycle of 4 to 5 years are no longer sustainable. Traditionally, it used to be 15 to 20 years. Ideally, that is the kind of, landscape that we have, root biomass that can regenerate, or the climate that we have, the rainfall. All of these could contribute. Our own studies in the university showed that minimally we have to maintain 10 years plus cycle. Otherwise, the soil health cannot be recuperated. And this is the area, perhaps the reason why there is a push for all of these things. The other one is, I think there is still communication gap between the shifting cultivators and the authorities in terms of the, as Mr. Jamir had mentioned, the social values. The traditional community-based fire management system has died down now because of non-existence or distorted form of shifting cultivation. The social ethics which women used to practice, for example, the first fruit that you harvest from the jhum, at least in my communities, that before you eat, you must share with your neighbor who share your jhum boundary. Then only you can eat. So that kind of social ethics that was there, concern for your neighbor, practiced by the women, are also not being seen as a value by many of the authorities. I think there has not been sufficient documentation of both jhum as a technical practice, jhum as a social values, to be able to appreciate by the community, by the authorities. And therefore, with the emergence of, let's say, forest laws, environmental laws, the practice is seen very, very differently. But having said that, Northeast is one of the areas where you have the highest concentration of jhum. At the same time, perhaps some of the best forest cover you still have in the Northeast. So, although there is all of these visions being seen negatively, but I think the plus point is because jhum is based on the need to manage forest, and therefore you still have such a large forest cover. Recently, there has been documentation by the Niti Aayog, and they're viewing shifting cultivation from different lands, the value that it might bring in, the traditional knowledge that it has on different aspects of conservation and practices. I think there are interest into revisit the way how it has to be seen. But having said that, the culprit is because the cycle has reduced, and that is the main area of concern, without which perhaps jhum could have been still sustainable.
Dr. Chetri, what do you see is the way forward there for jhum and shifting cultivation, considering the realities, the modern realities that shifting cultivators are faced with?
Actually, jhum is been always demonized, but now the scientists have started realizing that there is something good, very positive things in jhum. So in order to in order to transform the jhum, there are few points which already been tested also as well. For example, in Nagaland, the jhum cycle, the decreasing jhum cycle is increasing slowly from 4 to 5 years. Now it is gone to 10, 15, even 15 years in some villages. Like, for example, now there should be some kind of jhum improvement programs, or the modern technologies should be blended with the traditional knowledge. Like, there are a lot of good system is already there. We cannot force or we cannot put into the jhumias, the shifting farmers, some very high technologies into it. So now there is already a realization that we should amalgamate with the traditional knowledge, whatever modern technologies are there.
So I'll ask you, Mr. Jamil, briefly for a concluding statement, but vis-a-vis, if you look at it from the point of view of rural development projects, from that point of view, if you look at it and what they bring in, they are devising their projects, they're designing their projects, what would you say to them? And from the point of view of taking into consideration the nuances required to understand shifting and jhum cultivation?
Sometimes, and many a times, solutions to a problem lie within the problem, and people know how to go about it. It's just problem is we have too many consultants coming from outside telling us what to do. Second thing is the involvement of traditional village institutions, the Warshnongs and whatever village institutions you have. You need to involve them from the very beginning. So the important thing here is now, whatever interventions we do, whatever activity we want to do with the communities, we need to respect the traditions. We need to respect the social context of where Jhumias survive and what they do and why they do what they do. And last but not the least, it is very important to facilitate entrepreneurship and the marketing process for Jhumia products. Yeah.
Finally, Dr. Darlong, very briefly, I'm afraid we're running out of time, but your concluding statements on this, the way forward for to look at Jhum and shifting cultivation?
Well, I think I'd like to say that we need to really value both the views of the authorities and the views of the shifting cultivators. But what might be really needed today is social re-engineering of our communities to empower them. For example, you already have 8 to 9 Jhum Regulation Act in the Northeast, starting from Garo Hills to Nagaland to Arunachal Pradesh, Karbi Anglong, Mizoram, all of these. Now, the common thing in this Jhum Regulation Act is that while it, identifies the rights of the people to do Jhum and also their land rights, but at the same time, it gives them lots of responsibilities to demarcate areas for Jhum and also to see fire management, to see that soil health is maintained, to see that, settlement is not shifted all around. And also it prohibits areas where it has to be, it should not be done Jhum. For example, 400 meter away from water sources as per the Garo Hills Jhum Regulation Act, or 50 meter away from road, again from that same act. So social re-engineering is needed to re-educate our communities in terms of looking at already the practices that they have. On the other hand, perhaps we need to bring in more and more R&D, academic institutions, to do site-specific research, both for land technologies, crop technologies, and also things that can be done. For example, in Dima Hasao, we have introduced through IFAR project high-value Jhum crops of red rice, king chilies, and sesame. The income from household per year was nearly 20 to 40,000. But it has to be integrated with home garden and livestock subsystem of Jhum, and also other apiculture and other things that can be done. Without that, such thing cannot be sustained. And also promote the community forestry or community conserved areas in that area where the payment or rather ecological services of the village can be sustained. I think all of this, if we bring together, I am sure that we can sustain Jhum in a way that it actually looks at through the lens of the communities who are still practicing Jhum
cultivation.
Having said that, all of this which we do together, policy makers, the shifting cultivators, community institutions and research institutions together, I am sure we still have hope for Jhum as much as we have hope for biodiversity conservation, environmental balances within the landscape that the shifting cultivation is being practiced.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Dalong, and thank you very much, Mr. Jameer and Dr. Chetri, for joining us in this discussion. Now, before we started this discussion, we mentioned that if you saw shifting cultivation as just pockmarked hills and slash and burn, it's an incomplete picture. So I hope that through this discussion, we've been able to give you a fuller and more complete picture about the complexities and the nuances and also the positive aspects of Jhum and shifting cultivation. We've also highlighted some of the difficulties, and our experts and our panelists have also highlighted the way forward for Jhum and shifting cultivation. Thank you very much for joining us on this discussion.